Welcome to the ReReview podcast, where we watch movies from our past with a perspective from today. Your hosts are Matt, Bobby, and Austin, and we have an immense love for the films of our youth, so we're taking a look back to see if they still hold up. On this episode, we are discussing Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's released in 1988, directed by Robert Zemeckis. It stars Bob Hoskins, Christopher Lloyd, Joanna Cassady, and Charles Fleischer as the voice of Roger Rabbit. This movie tells the story of an alcoholic detective pushed to his limit to save a cartoon. Now, this is fair warning. We are spoiling a 33-year-old movie, so if you haven't seen it, we will be revealing key plot points. This is Bobby's choice, so he'll open up our discussion this week.
Yeah, I picked this movie because I really like the idea of it. I thought that mixing animation and live action is I think it's just a really engaging and interesting idea for a movie. And I feel like they put a pretty decent story behind that. So I want to get into that. But first, I just want to mention what an interesting technical achievement this movie is. Just how before really computers like merging animation and live action as well as they did it. And I mean the trick about talking about this movie is kind of like separating the technical achievement that it was from the story. So it's definitely falls into the whole noir theme of, the detective, and it certainly falls into some of the noir traps with the music and the whole stereotypes of the detective and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that the main actor Bob Hoskins did a really good job, essentially in a lot of scenes interacting with no other actors on screen, like only animation. And at some points, like especially in the Toontown version, like the Toontown city, he was basically like just entirely by himself, just interacting with probably just stagehands and cues and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that he did a really good job with it. I think it's really interesting about the freeways and all that kind of stuff, how it was based on history, how when in back in the 40s when California was having a traffic problem and people were kind of getting frustrated with trains, like how they design freeways and stuff. So, Matt, what do you think?
Well, I mean, as far as the movie itself goes, like you said, it's an interesting technical achievement. It reminded me kind of how Walt Disney kind of got his start, where he made the Alice in Wonderland shorts back in the day, where he'd mix live action filming with animation. So it's definitely was nothing new, but obviously this movie, even compared to some of its later comparative movies like Space Jam, for example, there's a lot of really dynamic shots in here, more than I remembered. And that's tricky. I mean, that's tricky even for like CG animation. I mean, we take it for granted being able to track the world, in a computer now. I can only imagine what these guys had to do in order to do that same thing. And I honestly, if you would have asked me thinking back on it, not having watched this movie for, man, at least 5 years now, were they going to be a lot of static shots or dynamic shots? I would have said static shots because those were easier. I can only imagine there was some artists, making this movie probably going gray from all the difficulty of making it. From a story perspective, like you were saying, it's a noir story through and through. I mean, the time period being in 1947, it's got that very classical detective feel. I mean, down to like the trench coats and the fedoras and the alcohol problems. And there wasn't a lot. And I don't even think there was any smoking in this movie now that I think about it.
The baby,
the stogies.
How could
that's
you
right.
forget
That is true.
Smoking?
The baby was the baby was the only one smoking in an era where they were trying to get kids off of smoking. But yeah, as a story, is a pretty straightforward story. It wasn't complex at all, but that's kind of how noir stories are, right? It did have a mystery element to it, which I think played out decently well. I don't think anyone was really surprised that, Judge Doom was the bad guy by the end. I mean, he basically had it plastered on his face, tattooed on his forehead, bad guy. But it played out pretty well.
He was a toon.
That was the surprise. And how it tied into, being a personal story for Eddie, and his brother. And it tied together well enough. It does have an air of convenience, right? It's a little bit too convenient how a lot of this stuff kind of tied together, and how Eddie happened to even get involved in this story, right? It's not because of those elements that he was dragged in. It just happened to be that he was the Toon Detective, right, back in the day. I guess in his modern incarnation of what his job was, he was kind of a sleazeball, right? And so they didn't mind him going around taking pictures of patty cake, I guess.
It is kind of strange, taking this gap since 5 years, good for you. I feel like it's been a lot longer since I've seen it. And with these much more adult eyes, there were jokes that my childish self did not get. There were definitely things, especially the just overabundance on the alcoholism portion. Oh boy, maybe I was thinking that was all okay as a kid. Now as an adult, I'm like, oh wow, he's got a problem. Especially
I
when they had,
definitely didn't notice that alcoholism was a problem. I mean, I knew like he poured it out and stuff like that, and that was a turning point for him. But
yeah, I don't
you,
even think that made sense to me as a kid. But starting with the scene with him at night with that bottle that was filled, and then he's sleeping on his desk in the morning, and the bottle's empty. You're like, oh, I see. We do have a little problem here. No wonder. What's her face's character? Joanna Cassady's character.
Oh, Dolores.
Probably, yeah, Dolores probably has a little bit of issues with your lifestyle, even though she still loves you because you're supposedly a good man. Oh my goodness.
and she works at a bar, so she's probably seen it firsthand.
And she's enabling him. Look at
Yeah,
how deep we're going into this. This is so sad. This is like the dark, seedy underbelly of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, even though technically, that's the whole point of the movie, maybe, is that all that's in there and you do have smoking babies. Yeah, I think this time gap watching it now, so many years later, it I found it still very entertaining, but maybe not as moving. Like I was smiling, but maybe all the jokes didn't hit the same way that they did. And it could be because of some odd familiarity. Again, it has been a long time since I saw it, but it kind of landed on, I think, what you've both mentioned so far. I was sort of more in awe by the technical stuff, and I don't want to just drain it down into, this movie impresses me because of what it did technically over the story, but it's like story wise, yeah, it's okay. All right, cool. I enjoyed it. I was trying to do the debate of is this, I watched it as a kid because obviously back then parents probably thought it was got cartoons. This is a movie for kids. Now I'm going, I probably wouldn't show this to my kid. There's some stuff in here that's kind of crazy, and it really is dark, especially I could say dip bothered me as a kid,
Oh yeah.
the idea of like killing cartoons. Like, come on, that's some dark, heavy stuff. Maybe early teens.
That was a traumatizing scene as a kid to watch. Like watching it again, it's traumatizing. It's that
Yeah,
poor little shoe.
they made that shoe look like a little puppy for sure. They're like, let's make this thing whimper like a puppy with its big sad eyes. And
Now,
then the residue paint on his glove looked like a big pile of blood dripping.
yeah, that's a bit dark. Even though, again, things we loved. Matt, you commented on this, but it's when did you ever expect to see Mickey and Bugs sharing screen time together?
It's a
Like,
massive
how
crossover
amazing is
movie.
that?
That's nowadays that's like years of contract negotiations and profit sharing, and it's just amazing to see those kind of characters, Daffy Duck, and just seeing the Looney Tunes and the Disney crowd intermingling with each other. I mean, that's kind of an amazing feat. I can't imagine that in 2021, to be honest.
No,
I
you
can't
can
help
only
but
use your same property if you're
And
doing.
this is true. It's easier just to go buy another company, and just that way it's part of the same company now.
Oh
And
yeah, Disney could do it today. They could get close. They could get really close.
but I just can't help but think about the contracts, like you said, when you see the two of them together. And I mean, going back to the technical thing, it is interesting just looking at that and the contracts and everything. And it's pretty hard to put that aside from the movie. I mean, like even looking closely at the cartoons, like where they had shadows and highlights, and they looked a little bit more 3D than normal. And even that cartoon in the very beginning looked a little bit like it had, like you were saying, a little bit more camera moves and a little bit more than just like kind of the standard animation that you would see like in the 80s and TV.
I mean, if we talk about the art, the thing I noticed, especially around Roger's character, but they had it in all of them, when they had the scenes where they were interacting with a human, there was sort of like a subtle haze or a glow as they moved. And while part of me knew they weren't necessarily matching the lighting of the room they were in, and we've reached a point where I end up paying attention to that stuff because either watching too much YouTube or playing too many video games, getting a better understanding of how lighting affects things and how things should match. But it never took it away from me that it wasn't one to one. It almost gave it its own unique quality that I was more than happy to look at. I kept staring, going, this is really, really well done. And I almost felt like it holds up so well today with only a few scenes where his first time in Toontown and they had that really wide shot. I was like, yeah, this one looks like crap. But other than that, like other pieces, I was just like, this is so well done. And I think the interaction with objects is what really sells it, because there were just all these little moments where you feel like things should have been off and they weren't. It was, yeah, I think you're getting back to how much work did they have to put in to dial in this animation like that.
Yeah, there was a lot of like grabbing of ties, and there's a lot of interaction between, and it, like you were saying, Matt, it would have been easy to just have a lock off camera and a character talking, well, maybe not easy, but easier, than just have a without any interaction. But there was a lot of clothes interaction, there was a lot of water and all sorts of things. And my understanding from watching some of the behind the scenes stuff is that they actually had like little robots and little like mechanized poles and stuff. So I mean, the interaction was very intentional, and I think they did a really great job of making it seem a lot more realistic than it could have been.
And you know what? An interesting thing, I guess, kind of going back to the story that I was kind of thinking about was, I remember vaguely, and maybe I might be wrong on this, but when I watched this originally, thinking that Eddie and Roger spent a lot more time together. In my mind, it was very much a buddy cop type movie. And I don't, watching it this time, I don't necessarily think that that is entirely the case. I definitely see it. But for some reason in my mind, they spent the entire movie together, and that wasn't entirely the case here, I think.
You say that, and I'm wondering, was this a trailer thing? Did we maybe get sold on that? Because you're right. You're giving me that feeling in the back of my head that there was definitely that impression I was supposed to have of it being that buddy cop feel. That of course, it wasn't. It wasn't at all.
It very much does feel like, if you remove the animated aspect of it, right? And I guess that's kind of like something that I'm trying to in my mind do, which is kind of tough, which is remove the animation aspect of it, because it's very easy to get drawn into the technical aspect of it, into the characters, because obviously these are all known characters, right? Would this movie have worked if Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck wasn't in this movie, if they were just a whole bunch of generic characters like Roger was? I am trying to find myself um, viewing it as just a noir movie. And in that case, you do kind of have that setup that you would see like in the 80s and 90s with the buddy cop movies, right? Where you have the straight shooter who's really serious and has a flaw in his past that kind of makes him so gruff and rough around the edges. And then you have kind of like the goofy partner, right? Who it's very much Lethal Weapon and a lot, except for some of the more riskier elements of it, but it does have kind of that aspect to it. And I do try to think, if I remove the technical aspect, the animation aspect, does it hold up as a buddy cop noir movie? And for the most part it does, but like you said earlier, Austin, with the whole, a lot of the jokes and stuff doesn't quite land as an adult watching it. I think that kind of plays to the detriment. I think some of that stuff does kind of hold it back sometimes, but it is supposed to be a Tex Avery-esque, movie with those kind of characters. So you can't really avoid it either.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the cartoony nature of Doom's death, maybe it's the thing that my parents probably didn't have to bat an eye thinking of how dark this movie actually was. But now I'm sitting here, with those jokes, with the timing, with how gruesome that was. I was like, I wonder, What other cartoons would I have shown my kid before this? Because using all those characters, those are the things you were showing your 5, 6, 4-year-old even, things that they're familiar with. And all of a sudden they're in a very, very adult world.
I'm not letting my 6-year-old watch this for quite some time, and she's very skittish about scary stuff, so she would not want to watch this, but it's gonna be a good long time before she's watching this.
Oh, she'll have dreams. I had dreams. Yeah, that dip scene. You're right. We're basically having our trauma therapy session here. What this movie did to us as kids,
That's high-pitched screaming doom voice is just haunting.
but still entertaining.
And so I actually am curious to, because obviously Christopher Lloyd plays Judge Doom, and he's such a great actor. What do you actually think of him as the villain? Do you think he does a good job as the villain, or did they, for example, like, was his connection to Eddie really necessary? Could he still have been the villain of the movie without that connection? Because it was like literally the last minute of Judge Doom's existence in this movie that all of a sudden is like, hey, by the way, I'm that dude who dropped the piano on your brother, Eddie. But as a villain, do you think he really holds up decently, or
Maybe he had to say it as part of his monologue to remind the audience, because the only information we got earlier is the red eyes and the specific laugh, and since it was so early in the movie, they figured, well, maybe everyone forgot, so he's got to tell him, and I killed your brother, type of thing. As far as his performance, I don't know. I kind of feel like it's hard not to love that man, right?
I agree. To answer your question for me, I feel like I don't know, the whole thing is I mean, it definitely had like an over the top sense to it. So I think that kind of played into it. But I mean, I do really like Christopher Lloyd a lot, but I think that there was a lot of things interesting with that character. Like he was a judge, but he was seemed like he was judge, jury, and executioner, and like a detective himself. He seemed to like go into the bar trying to hunt down Roger. I didn't really understand, like, okay, he's a judge, like, why is he doing these things? What is his actual job to do? And it seemed like he was just his job for this movie was just to be villainous.
Had to murder tunes.
and it's kind of a weird thing too to think that his end goal in all this, and it's such a California thing, right? That the end goal, the whole reason why at least 2 people have been murdered, and his whole end game was to build an 8-lane freeway. It. I guess they kind of wrote it off as it was a crazy thing that only a tune would think of. But it is kind of a disappointment. I had literally forgotten that was the motivation behind this whole thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had forgotten that the freeway was the reason why he wanted to do all this. And I do kind of question, like, if it actually creates true character motivation that as a tune, he wants to build a freeway.
He's a capitalist.
Yes.
And the movie's just poking fun at our, the way we progress as society, right?
I guess. I mean, maybe if it was supposed to be insidious in nature, like he was just an evil tune, and to him, even though he said there was going to be no more traffic jams, he knew that wasn't going to be true, and it was going to take 25 years to finish a quarter-mile of freeway anyway. So
that is the ultimate evil ploy, is to ensure that 30 years later, people would be sitting on the 405 or the 5, needing to go a whopping 2 miles and taking 2 hours.
But what if he's not? What if, like, how they always say, okay, like villains, all they have is just a different point of view, right? So what if his deal is he just wants to create like some kind of like urban utopia? Like like I mean, he definitely has a way of going about it, like he's making his dream happen no matter what, no matter who he kills. But
well, I mean,
it's kind of interesting.
I mean, I would say that'd probably be true if it wasn't for the. Now, I don't know how it was like back in the day. I know this isn't the case today, but the fact that the transportation system worked in that world, and even the characters themselves admitted that there would be no point in building a freeway because you could just spend a dime which Eddie couldn't afford. Apparently, he had to jump on the back, but that was a viable means of transportation for everyone else. So it was literally like, the quote unquote potentially true reason why they really built freeways and stuff like that, and did minimize our public transportation system on this side of the world, was to sell cars. Like, was that his next stage, was to get into he's going to buy part of Ford or something like that and just start selling cars too?
I looked it up, and I can tell you this is probably why this movie takes place in 1947. It's because they have what's called the Master Plan of Metropolitan Los Angeles Freeways. It's adopted by the Regional Planning Commission in 1947. It was a plan to create freeways.
So are you telling me the tunes are in place for like the random animal some endangered species that we ended up killing to build all these freeways?
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I mean, basically,
So
like
dark.
the history of, you can look it up on Wikipedia, look up Southern California freeways on Wikipedia. And in the first paragraph, it talks about the Regional Planning Commission of 1947. And it goes on to this big story about how basically, like, a lot of people in Southern California and that area thought that railroads were corrupt, and so they decided to go with, which could have been a misinformation campaign by automobile industry, but there was actually a famous red car streetcar lines moving around that were very popular in the 1910s and 20s, and that kind of lost its profitability, and moving on to automobiles, which leads to your freeways. And in fact, actually, this article does say that traffic congestion was a very big concern in the 1930s.
It still is. 100 years later.
Shockingly, freeways didn't solve the problem.
So I do find it kind of interesting that there are some things about this story that, although it's very fantastical with cartoons and stuff, that some of it is grounded in history.
Yeah. Let's pivot to the ending. Were they setting up a part 2?
How do you mean?
I mean, what's interesting is I think that the only way a part 2 would have gone is just the continuation of Doom's dream, right? Like you mentioned when we were watching it, like, you can't give something like Toontown 2 tunes, they will destroy it, right?
Yeah,
Like,
what does it mean for them to have it, and would it be interesting to see a story of this world where they still get to exist? What happens post Doom? Who becomes a new villain? Are they managing to actually make that Toontown work without human guidance?
Turns into a giant franchise wars between Disney and Warner Brothers. And I mean, I don't think that a sequel probably could have worked with it, just because this one only really worked because, something we see a lot nowadays where you take something like the superhero movie and you mix it with a different genre. And that's how you prevent it from going spaghetti Western and become really stale really quick. This one only really works because it is a mix of a noir with that whole kind of theming behind it. I don't know if you could really I think you end up in a Space Jam situation, right? Where, and I'm not saying that one was necessarily a solid first movie, but the follow-up with Brendan Fraser was not a good follow-up. And I feel like you'd probably end up in that same situation where, actually, now that I think about it, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe it's something like we'll have to look up later or whatever, but I feel like there was going to be a Roger Rabbit sequel now that I think about it.
Yeah, they had talked about it for a really long time, and it just died, probably because of contracts and stuff.
And so you're saying someone's going to try to bring it back?
No. I don't know if at this point it's possible, but for sure at the time I had read that there were discussions about making one.
It would be interesting to see how they revise or try to do this art today, and hopefully not in the Space Jam way where they mix 3D and stuff. But I mean, there's such a nostalgic joy to cell type animation.
So I actually want to throw something out there. And it's probably from my point of view, it's one of the longest lasting aspects of this movie and pop culture. I would like to talk about Jessica Rabbit, if we may, without it getting too into the mud or whatever. Obviously,
Go on.
she has become a character unto herself, where I feel like, out of this entire movie, and there is a technical aspect of it, but just the image of Jessica Rabbit has become something of a pop culture thing where most people will recognize. I mean, I think even in Disney World, and I don't know if it wasn't Disney Springs before, but in their version of Countdown Disney and Pleasure Island, I believe was what it was. They had Jessica Rabbit as kind of like the icon for a while.
Really?
Just, and it's such a weird thing, especially when you really break down the fact that it's a 2D character that's hyper sexualized the way that she was. But
hourglass figure, very intense, suggestive speeches and words. I mean, you basically had cartoon love with Hoskins' character. He questioned himself in the presence of her,
as we all did, I'm sure, growing up. But
I mean, she's the reason we have Cool World, right?
Yeah, Cool World came out in like the early 90s, right? It probably was. That was probably like the early version of a fan fiction. It's like, what if Eddie and Jessica Rabbit actually did hook up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's fine. I guess I don't have an issue with the character. Maybe that's where you want to go, depending on where that particular character could sit in a world like today. And what would happen if you bring her back? You mentioned Space Jam earlier, and we already know people had a lot of issues with how they redid one of the characters there. So you can imagine, what does it mean to redo a character like that? But I feel like she fits the theme of the movie.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the only way I see it is, I mean, is her character necessary? Yeah, probably not. But I mean, I think that from the idea of the story point, I mean, I think that a cartoon is very bombastic and bigger than life, and everything is exaggerated. And when you take a woman like that, it's like she says herself, she's not bad. She's just drawn that way.
Which comes back to who created these characters, but that's a different thing. Go on, man.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Is the whole, I think I brought it up while we were watching it, was, was this another dimension, that, they cracked into somehow, or were these actually drawn characters that came to life? I mean, that's a whole can of worms about sentient bags and, taxi cabs and stuff like that. And does the taxi cab need gasoline to go? There's so many questions you could probably have about that, but
there is a rabbit hole there.
It's like the Toy Story paradox, where you not playing with your toys makes them sad.
Wait, so us not watching cartoons? Where's this?
Look at Betty Boop. She took a job as a cocktail waitress.
And now I'm sad. Because this is where all the cartoon characters go when we stop watching.
We watch more Merry Melodies. Damn it.
So yeah, where did we land on Jessica Rabbit?
I kind of disagree. I do think that she was a necessary character. I think she actually drove a lot of the story forward. She was almost like the almost like living Maltese Falcon in a way, where like she was trying to drive a lot of the mystery aspects of it. Obviously, she added the sex appeal that you would expect from, because in noir movies, there was always that character, right? The bombshell that was kind of like the bad girl who, was helping the main character, but also potentially was working for the bad guy or whatever. But as far as Jessica Rabbit herself, I don't think as a character that it's necessarily a bad thing that they over sexualized or anything like that. It fits into what her character is supposed to be. Maybe it does play into what she says, that she was just drawn that way. She answered it herself.
But maybe not for like 6-year-old kids who are watching a cartoon for the first time.
No, maybe not so much.
This is not for 6-year-old kids, despite the fact that it's a cartoon in many parts of it.
With all the characters that your 6-year-old kids watch.
Right.
All right, so we'll get to the point that I always ask because we're near the end. Matt, what do you think? Are you recommending this movie in 2021 to someone to watch?
I would recommend this movie over somebody watching the new Space Jam. The
indictment on LeBron James just coming down on the podcast.
I'll always respect the king. I will never disrespect the man, but I think that even though, this movie was like 33 years old, I think it holds up really well. The animation holds up really well, especially in today's day and age. I think that there's a charm to seeing 2D animation. And it would garner appreciation, I think, just imagining the kind of work that went into it. And the story's solid. Like I said, it's straightforward. It's not overly complicated. But it's engaging. I was never bored. I would recommend it to somebody who hasn't seen it. And if you haven't seen it in a long time, it's worth, throwing it in the Blu-ray player and checking it out again.
Bobby?
Yeah. One quick note before I give my review is that, the sequel that they were talking about, that I read that it was actually going to be a prequel. It was supposed to take place in 1941 to 1943. So it was going to be like the stories of the Valiant brothers, but that never happened. But I definitely agree with Matt. I mean, this movie is an absolute technical marvel, and I mean, I was very engaged watching it, and I would recommend to watch it, just not small kids.
I think we have a trifecta here. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth watching, especially now this many years later, appreciating the things that may have been missed in terms of some of those adult-related jokes, and really being in awe of what we couldn't help but talk about is the technical aspect and things that they did, because it really, really is impressive. And let's say you do have kids, maybe not so young, but if they are burgeoning creators, this is a great thing to look at to kind of understand, what people were doing before computers ruled the world for TV and movies. It's kind of crazy to think about this and how we've come so far to something like The Mandalorian, even where they're using Unreal Engine to make an entire TV show, and they're doing something like this so long ago that still looks so good today. It's it's definitely really, really impressive. So definitely pick it up if you have time, watch it for sure. So as always, thank you for listening, and remember, if you don't have a good sense of humor, you're better off dead.